critical race theory. That's an excellent example of how if you get a bunch of brilliant minds who have similar backgrounds and similar experiences and put them all together in isolation from larger reality, they can come up with an idea that is more terrible than any of them could have come up on their own. Not that it's better, but is worse than any idea that they could have come up with on their own, or even the average person. Their brilliance in a small insular setting sort of fed on each other to come up with something that is very scary, is very irrational. It's a very bad idea for all the reasons I'm going to describe, or I'm going to touch on here. And I'm going to show you go to the wiki page and see who the founders of critical theory are. And you'll see they share a common background. And that common background is a Jewish heritage from Germany and from Central Europe. And what shaped their moral reality, I'm sure, is the persecution that their Jewish ancestors had faced, not just in the Holocaust, which was the generation they were in, but in pogroms and persecutions that occurred before that. And so I think they learned, the lesson they got out of it was the overwhelming, indeed only factor that matters in determining morality is who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed. If someone is an oppressor, if some group is an oppressor, then everything they do is subject to scrutiny. Every action they take to sort of stay on top, or we might call it even looking out after our own interests, as all humans do, is taken in the worst possible connotation and considered to be something wrong. Whereas if you are one of the oppressed, then anything you do is justified to get on top. You've been oppressed, so it's okay if you do X or Y. Now, if the oppressors try to do something even less harmful than X or Y, it's terrible and wrong, and they're trying to perpetrate their oppression and stay on top. And this is it's based on some things that really happened to them or to their immediate ancestors. And so that part is not separated from reality. But what is separated from reality is that this is the only factor that matters. That you find out who the oppressor is, and you say that's the one that's always wrong. Everything they do is just to help them stay on top, and it's always wrong. The oppressed, whatever they do, is justified because they're the oppressed, and you can't judge them for it. And I'm exaggerating mildly for effect, but not much, because it goes beyond simple morality. Morality is very important. And there was a traditional Christian view of morality that said oppressors are bad because humans by nature are sinful and unclean, and men are not reasonable apart from relationship with God. They need to connect to God to get reasonable and to get, in some denominations, a true free will. So that's the traditional view, but this view isn't like that. This view says there is no one reality. Each group has its own reality, and individuals are not individuals. They are defined as the sum total of all the groups they're in. And it's scary dehumanizing, basically, but it is what is necessary to justify their belief that, well, you have your reality and we have ours. Therefore, X is immoral for you and X is moral for us. In order to get there, and in order to get to the point where really what it does is it takes away all routes to reconciliation between the groups. It accepts that people are going to be forever separate. You have your reality and we have ours. And no, it doesn't have to make sense to you, and yours doesn't have to make sense to ours. So it does a little bit tie into the Jewish history of a separate and set apart people. And so what you see is a bunch of guys that, in their brilliance, they combined their heritage, they combine their unique view of things, and they come up with an idea that is worse and more terrible than anything they could have come up with individually, just feeding off each other. But it's had incredible influence. The Frankfurt School and the ideas of these men is where critical theory comes from, and now it is the latest rage and the latest thing, and I think you can see what's wrong with it. I think you can see the idea that's what's wrong with it. But my point is, I think it's going to be the trigger for the next great persecution of the Jewish people. They didn't mean it like that, but that's the way it's going to wind up. Now, before I go there, I want to just briefly talk about these men who are the fathers of critical theory. And then we're going to go, and I'm going to show you that the morality, the new morality they've tried to come up with, that justifies double standards, that justifies, I'm not even going to try to reason with you, that justifies terrible things. Where like if you see a big guy beating up on a little guy, the big guy's always wrong, even if the little guy is Chucky, the murderous doll. So, but let's go over the guys who founded critical theory and see the commonalities that shaped their view, and they sort of got in an echo chamber at the Frankfurt School and came up with critical theory. First up, Max Horkheimer. Max Horkheimer lived from 1895 to 1973, so he lived through the Holocaust. He was a German. He was from an Orthodox Jewish family. He became a Marxist. And so what we see here is, without the restraints of religion and that sort of view of thought that I shared before, where humans just left to ourselves are sinful and unclean, and we have to connect with God to clean up our sneaking thinking. Without that, they've got this philosophy of, well, this group of humans has their own thinking, and it's just, there's no God, so it's just as right as any other group, and that other group may have its own thinking, and the two will never meet, and that's okay because there's no God and there's no one truth. That's what you get when you transfer. You get smart people that are not restrained by the knowledge of God. So there's Max Horkheimer. There's one guy. Let's go to the next one. Next up is Erich Fromm. And Erich also was born in 1900. He lived through the Holocaust. For a while as a young man, he was a Zionist. He was born to Orthodox Jewish parents. He studied the Talmud, but he sort of turned things on their head and said, well, it was a positive good that Adam and Eve, for example, decided they wanted for themselves to know what was good from evil. He valued humans instead of just looking to authority, humans making their own decisions. And you can kind of see where this leads to in critical theory. It's the idea that, well, now every group of humans has different ideas. You can't just have one universal idea of right and wrong without God as a unifying factor. Human beings are different. They come to different conclusions about reality. And so what happens is, taking the fruit, the power to decide what is good and evil for yourself, it doesn't lead to an order. It leads to chaos, where all sorts of different groups have different ideas of right and wrong. How do you resolve those ideas? Well, their cut and dried answer is, whoever is oppressed is in the right. Whoever the oppressor is wrong. Whoever is on top should be put on the bottom. Whoever's ever on the bottom should be put on the top. Now, is that a recipe for order, or is it a recipe for chaos? As soon as the guys that are lowly win, they become the bad guys. So there is never any peace. There is never any reconciliation. The reconciliation is found in ideas that these men rejected. The idea that right and wrong come from a creator God, that different groups of men cannot make their own morality. They have to look up to really understand it and really change if they find that they're out of alignment with their created order. So there's Erich Fromm. Let's go to the third guy. The next father of critical theory is Theodor Adorno. Now, he was not born Theodor Adorno. He was born Theodor Ludwig Wiesengrund. His father was a Jew from Germany who had converted to Protestantism. His mother was an Italian Catholic. I believe she was from, or French. I believe she was from Corsica. And so he was probably the least narrowly affected of any of them, But he was still, he was born in 1903. He died in 1969. So he lived through the Holocaust. That definitely shaped him. He was very sympathetic to Marx. Really, I don't know of any of them that were not sympathetic to Marx. A lot of Marxism in that group of people. But he was coming at from a little bit different angle. As you can imagine, his background was more diverse. He was on the artistic side of things. And for him, it was about the duality of man, and how we have a primitive side. And he wanted to embrace that. He did not want our primitive instincts to be suppressed. That was his big contribution to critical theory. And I want my primitive instincts to be suppressed. Suppressing my primitive instincts is the only reason I haven't killed multiple people, is probably the truth of it, and done some other bad things besides. So, but he's rejecting that. He thinks it's oppression to suppress our primitive instincts, and let's get it out. And so therefore, I guess a culture that wants people to act civilized and behaved is an oppressor. Whereas the oppressed culture is all these primitive instincts people have that they think that he would think in his philosophy is unfairly suppressed by civilization. And that's his contribution to critical theory. And I think you can see how this contrasts with the Christian view of man, the classical Western view of man, that we have the old man that is passing away, that's sinful, that is unclean, that needs to repent, that needs to be crucified, and we need to have a new life. And that's the life we need to grow in. And so it's a totally different idea about who man is. He agrees, like with Christians, that man has a dual nature. But instead of saying the higher nature should overcome the lower nature, he's saying it's wrong for the higher nature to overcome the lower nature. And so that's his contribution. Let's go look at the next guy. Next on the list is Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin was born in the late 1800s, but he died in 1940, so he did not really live through the Holocaust. His effort, basically, he was born to Ashkenazi Jewish parents in Germany, and he was sort of combining Kabbalah, sort of a medieval Jewish idea that basically turned the Bible on its head. What was bad was good, you might say, in Kabbalah, and wanted to combine that into a new theory of history. And so that, to me, that adds to the chaos. It's like what they did in the Tower of Babel, building their own religion. Let's build a new religion by taking an old religion that was heretical, that was outside the mainstream, and putting our own spin on it, and use that to justify, because man has a spiritual component. And so the old theology, we don't like the old theology. It doesn't tell us what we want to hear. Let's find an old theology that kind of says what we want to hear, dust it off, put some new bells and whistles on it, and use that to fill this spiritual gap in the human soul. And that was his contribution. He died at 48, but he was considered, if you go to the Wikipedia page, he'll be listed as one of the fathers of critical theory. Let's go to the next one. Herbert Marcuse was born upper middle class bourgeois Jewish parents in Germany. He lived from 1898 to 1979. So again, he experienced the Holocaust, and his big contribution, I think, was this twisted definition of tolerance, where tolerance is totally one-sided. You have to tolerate the forces that are attacking your culture, but the forces attacking your culture do not have to tolerate your ideas. They should be allowed to speak freely if they're undermining your oppressive cultures, but you are wrong and being oppressive if you try to stop them from saying what they're saying and doing what they're doing. So, where did the left get this twisted idea of tolerance that it's a one-way street? It's from him. This is the guy. That's his big contribution. So I think you see how this does a tremendous amount of harm to reason, to real dialogue, to people reconciling, to people finding common ground. It reinforces all these men together. You see what I'm saying? How the bad ideas of each of these men put together created a whole that's even worse than what they could have individually come up with. He is yet another example of that. So they're your founders of critical theory. Now, let's tie this in to the Jewish question. Most of these guys came from a background of at least comfort, if not privilege financially. And yet they were part of a group of people that didn't save them. When it was time for them to get oppressed, which it happened more than once, they got oppressed. And so they defined morality in these terms. The convention, they were from a minority sect, usually, in a larger culture. And that larger culture tried to make them conform to their standards. And some of those standards may have been good and some of them weren't, but this shaped them. It shaped their view on things. They learned to see that as always a bad thing. And so that kind of has defined their morality. And the problems are, as I have laid out here, they're taking a very narrow view of right and wrong. Right and wrong is a lot more complicated than that. Sometimes if the group is trying to change your views, they're wrong and you should ignore them. Sometimes they're right and you should change. And their philosophy doesn't seem to allow for that. Really, and we should tolerate each other. It isn't just one side should tolerate and the other should not. Within limits, it's like engineering. Tolerance is an engineering term. You can have too little tolerance and it's bad for the machine. You can have too much tolerance and it's bad for the machine. So much of these things are a matter of balance. They're taking something that is true, but putting it out of balance. It is true that it is wrong for the majority to oppress the minority. It is true it is wrong for the rich to oppress the poor. It is wrong to do those things. But you cannot completely define morality in those terms. If someone is oppressed, that doesn't justify everything they do to the oppressor. If someone is an oppressor, it doesn't mean that everything they do is wrong or that they're incapable of ever doing anything right. So when they came up with this, Jews who all but one of them lived through the Holocaust. He died as the Holocaust was just right before it started. They never dreamed that there would ever be a situation in which the Jews could be considered the oppressors. It never occurred to their mind. In their minds, I'm sure, the Jewish people had been oppressed throughout history. And so they assumed that would be the case. And so they had this morality that let everybody have their own morality. So if you're a Jewish group and you don't want to conform to the WASP majority in your nation, then you had every right to, and they're wrong to even expect you to change. And that's what they're saying. But further, that totally defined morality, and it's just not true. Morality is more complicated than that. They wanted to boil it down, and they wanted to boil people down to being the sum total of the groups they were in, and then assigning them a position of their own reality, and then the other group assign theirs. When the truth is, people are individuals. Their background, the background of these men who came up with these ideas, might not be very diverse. They might have seen things a lot alike. But that's not the world. That's not the earth. And now we see the world views, except for evangelical Christians, mostly in America, the world sees Israel as the oppressor. I think a lot of poor people notice that not the Orthodox Jews, not most Jews, but they see some wealthy Jews, they see Jews in high positions in government, and they assume, well, the Jews are wealthy, the Jews have positions of power, the Jews have a lot of positions in media, therefore they are the oppressors. And they've sort of turned this philosophy that these men of Jewish heritage created, and it's turned on them. It's become what could be the source of the next great persecution of the Jews. And unfortunately, it is more irrational than Nazism because it holds to this idea that each group has their own reality. So people, the Jews can't appeal to reason with adherents of their own theory and say, look, we're not really the oppressors. There's reasons for what we're doing. Can't we all find some common ground here? No, we can't because of your ideas. So we don't have to find any common ground. And that's very dangerous. It's very scary. And I think what they might find, if this keeps going, if the critical theory gains more acceptance, along with all the other groups who really don't like Jewish people, the only friends they have left, the only protection from them and the mob, is evangelical Christians who have a worldview that is totally the reverse of critical theory. That'll be their only ally, their only protection. But ultimately, I think the protection just goes beyond that one group of Christians. It goes to this total view of reality that is the opposite of the view of reality these men who taught critical theory believed. It is not good that man wants to determine for himself what is right and wrong, instead of seeking out authority from a higher source than human will. It is not good to say, you have your truth and I have mine. It is not good to say, I'm going to break morality down into this is the oppressor and this is the oppressed. The oppressed can do no wrong. The oppressor can do no right. It is not good to say, just because a community wants me to do something, it's wrong and I should resist it. There are times to resist it. I've been the person who resisted. I've been where I say, this doesn't make sense. This isn't right. And everyone wanted to go the other way, and I had to go the opposite way. So I understand why they come up with this and why they say reality is not determined by the majority view of whatever nation you're in. But guess what? They've tried to thread the needle too carefully, haven't they? They wanted to take the power of determining right and wrong away from God, but they didn't want the majority of humans to have it. So what did they do? They divided people into groups and said, you each, not only are you taking the right to choose good from evil away from God, you're also taking it away from your fellow man. And but how do you prevent complete chaos then? Each man being his own God, each man thinking he has his own law. Well, you divide into groups then. And everybody in your group, you can have, your individuality will be lost in that group, but at least it'll be closer to what you want. And that is their answer. And it's a terrible answer. It's a scary answer. And it's an answer that might bring about the next and trigger the next great persecution of the Jewish people. And the irony is, Jews that suffered from the last great persecution of the Jewish people are the ones who planted the seeds. They are the ones that produced the philosophy which is going to be unleashed on their people. And that is a shame. It's not the answer. We need to return to the classic Western way of looking at things, which was not rejected because it didn't work. It was rejected because they didn't want to do it. That's all. Now, maybe we can take the best of classical thought and reject the worst of it. And that's what every generation should do. Every generation should improve using that method, not a method where we're going to start from a blank page every generation.